I asked you to come on to tackle our biggest questions for every eliminated playoff team that, hopefully their fans aren't that have recovered from their postseason losses. I figured we could begin with alphabetical order. And so I'll throw it to you. What is your biggest question for the Atlanta Hawks entering this offseason?
I think it's kind of two, but they're related. It's how do they rebalance this roster a little bit as far as the cap sheet goes, but not downgrading too much in talent. I thought it was very interesting that Travis Schlenk, it's funny because people made fun of him a little bit because the quote that was pulled was, we're going to try to upgrade the roster. And I was like, isn't that your job every off season? But the real picture was when he said, we stood pat and we probably shouldn't have. We were okay with the status quo, and we probably should have been more aggressive. And I think what's happened is now it sounds great to use all that cap space a couple of years ago as they did, and I think in general they used it well. But then you do extensions for Kevin Huerter, Clint Capella, and then the big one for Trae Young, which kicks in next year, which is likely to be the so-called supermax extension for him. That's gets into a tricky spot because now all of a sudden you're very, very expensive for a team that barely made it through the play-in. So that's where you got to start to figure out where are we going, because DeAndre Hunter's up next and all that. So I'm very curious to see how do you rebalance while not going so crazy with your cap and tax payment.
Right. And they're not a team that's going to just eat all those sort of extra costs. And they Correct. Do have I think Gallinari is $5 million partial guarantee at 21.5. My question was along the similar lines. And when you look at their cap sheet is how do they everyone's like, they need to make a consolidation trade. And that comes down to sort of rebalancing the roster where it doesn't feel like their defense struggled a lot this year. It was good to close the season. It's tough to read into what happens when you close the season, but their live ball defense in particular was just bad this year. And you have DeAndre Hunter probably skewed more towards disappointment than someone who made progress. But sort of like after him and Clint Capella, you have DeLon Wright, you could bring him back. But like, how do you retinker with this roster to make it better defensively? And I think it's easy for me to sit here, anyone to sit here, and I'm guilty of this doing all the time. Oh, they need to make a consolidation trade. For who? For what? When you just look at this market of who could become available, I think the name that gets thrown out a bunch is Jeremy Grant. That's not someone you consolidate into, in my book. Like, you're not looking to trade John Collins and stuff for Jeremy Grant. Like, that doesn't make any sense. And so that's some of the real challenges of this roster is, can they add more defense given their flexibility? And if you think you need to make a consolidation trade, because I look at the front line immediately. I think John Collins is still wildly underrated. But between him, Clint Capella, I love Onyeka Okongwu. I love me some Jalen Johnson, too. Like, he played in some small ball lineups this year. I just don't know what you necessarily do, especially knowing you can't stand pat, because we just saw what happens when you stand pat.
Yeah, it's funny because I think you have to have some really honest conversations in that front office as you're sitting down and mapping this out of who are we? Are we the team that made it to these finals? Are we the team that barely made it into the playoffs? Or are we somewhere in between that? Like, and that's probably where the truth lies, right? They're probably not quite as bad as they looked this year, and they're probably not as good as making these finals. But then it becomes, where are we going? This is clearly Trae Young's team, right? There's no question about that. You paid him. I know right now people are beating him up because like you can't win with a guy like that and all this stuff. Well, I mean, you can. You just got to get the right guys around him. We've seen teams win with guys like Trae Young before, and clearly they think they can, because otherwise they would not have paid him the way they did. But I think what really becomes kind of the question now is, who are those right guys around him? Do you have some of them already? Yeah, probably. I think John Collins is one of them. I'm with you. I've loved John Collins. I'm not a big college basketball guy. I'm the guy who flies in conference tournament week, and then is like, I make all my pronouncements from there through the tournament and generally look like an idiot, right? But I fell in love with John Collins because I was just like, this guy's got a nice 15-foot jump shot. His form looks like it'll extend out to the three-point line. He rebounds. We year over year, it's been proven that's the one skill that definitely translates to the NBA is rebounding. And like, I was like, this guy's just going to be good. And then got to the league and all those things, it's one of the rare times I was like absolutely right on somebody who got picked, outside of the top 5. So I really like him. I find myself looking at, I'm like, boy, I like a lot of these guys. So one thing it's funny saying consolidation trade, figure it out, all this stuff. I hope they don't go too far and
Mhm.
go crazy making moves, because I think a lot of it is like it was for a lot of teams this year, better health, less games missed due to COVID stuff. And you're probably right back, kind of in the mix in the middle of the East playoff picture versus, being a true top tier team, but they're better than they looked last year. So just don't go crazy trying to, well, we got to tear it all down and reset and rebuild, because I think that's going too far.
I'm totally with you. And I'm also just curious as to like, maybe I'm way off here, but it feels like you could move Clint Capella and improve the roster more so than upgrade from John Collins. And
I
that's
agree.
what's tough for me to wrap my head around, because Collins all of a sudden was thrust in this role where he couldn't be the primary screener once you had Capella, and he adapted to it. The way he moves off the ball, a little bit of a floor game shooting. I know Clint Capella is better defensively, but he feels like the player that would be easier to replace, as much as I hate to say it. And I also just don't know, who are you getting if you're featuring either of them in a trade? And I don't want to talk about this scenario too much because we will get to this team in particular. But like, are you one of the people that falls into the camp of like Clint Capella, build out the package from there and go after Rudy Gobert, and that does enough for you? Or do you still sort of fall into some of the same problems you have, where Rudy Gobert is a generational rim protector and defender? He's an upgrade
Mhm.
from Clint Capella, clearly, but like, you're not, while acquiring Rudy Gobert, like, you're still not addressing some of your live ball defensive issues on the perimeter.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there. I think the first part I would say is I'm with you with I would keep Collins over Capella too. And I think there is almost a sense of, well, what Collins does as a four is very replaceable. You can replace it with a smaller player, bigger minutes for DeAndre Hunter, whatever. I think what gets overlooked, and I think this is what has maybe been forgotten from the prior playoff run, was he actually showed he can handle some small ball 5 minutes
Mm.
in that run to these finals. More on second units, like you can get away with downsizing there. He's not somebody you're going to plug in against starters, playing small ball five, because he'll just get taken advantage of. But I do think I would build that out. And I do wonder if you could build that package, Capella and something,
Stuff,
Hunter,
yeah.
Herder stuff. Yeah, for Gobert. I don't hate that idea, because it's two things. One, I think we've seen Rudy Gobert can be pretty good as a roll man and as a lob threat
Mhm.
around the rim. Trae Young he's more than willing to throw those passes, more so than the Utah guards have been. I also think it's the upgrade defensively is just so massive. You just got to be cautious. I wouldn't want to sacrifice too much of my wing depth to go get that, because I think that's the single hardest thing to find is quality wing depth in the
Mhm.
league right now. You can find bigs, you can find guards. It's just those true wings that can kind of play on both ends. That's where you can get yourself in trouble. But Atlanta's dealing from a little bit of a position of strength there, because you've got Bogdanovich, Hunter, and Herder, who are all pretty good, that you could move in, and you still have DeLon Wright that you can bring back. And I think they could get more mileage out of Wright and Young playing together than they did this year. I
Mhm.
would like to see that as a combo, because that also allows Trae Young to work a little bit more off ball, and I think he can be a pretty dangerous weapon. I think this is just for Atlanta. It's now, you had your good playoff experience, you had your rough bounce back year. Now it's growing from there and growing into whatever you're going to be as kind of your fully formed version of this iteration of the team.
We are the 8 minutes on the team are up, but you mentioned something that I wanted to throw to you really quickly. Do you think that the players that are on this team will allow Trae Young to be off the ball next season? And it feels like this will be the third consecutive offseason in which we're wondering whether that happens. And Nate McMillan, I think, mentioned something about it in the exit interview. Is this, it doesn't, I think you could get better personnel so that you could move Trae Young off the ball, but this doesn't necessarily feel like a case of they have Bogdanovich, even Kevin Herter, like, and DeLon Wright, like, that's enough. It's just, it doesn't feel like they tried it, whether that's coaching or Trae Young's, functional proclivities. I don't know, but I'm just curious to see, are they going to do anything with a move or a transaction in terms of adding players, or is this just, we have to commit to it next season to try it?
Yeah, I think I think just general, this is an opinion I've had for a little bit now, and it's kind of been formulating for a couple of years. I think when somebody wants to play a really dominant offensive player off ball, one of the things is it seems to be, to make it work, you have to have a big that can really pass. because that's generally how you open up a lot of that stuff. He pulls the other big away, and that just opens up that screening action, removes that clutter as a player tries to work themselves open. Atlanta doesn't really have that, but I think you can still get there. You just have to be really deliberate about the way you're going to design those sets and actions to do that. And I think you could get a lot out of, hey, use Trae Young as a screener for a guy like Herter, because then you're stressing the defense there, because Herter's a really good shooter, or Bogdanovich, because if you switch it and he gets a smaller guy, he'll just take that guy down, back him down, and shoot the jumper over top of him. So that's where I think you could get a lot more creative. It just, you got to have somebody to deliver that pass. But whether it's DeLon Wright, maybe you could put a little bit more on Collins' plate to do those kind of things. I do think that is something you have to figure out, because I think that's the best way to unlock and make the game easier for Trae Young as well.
Just imagining Trae Young setting screens. Hopefully he's better at those than defending screens.
Yeah, right. Teams are just going to kind of, blow through him almost like he's a ghost, right? Because it's going to be like, wait, was there the screen there? I didn't feel it.
I will say it does seem like his game would be more scalable in that regard offensively than if you tried to use Luka or ever James Harden in that type of role, where people compare him to them so often. I do feel like there's a little bit of a difference there based off the way he shoots and the way we've seen him move.
And I don't want to be the millionth person to make the Steph Curry comp here, but they get a lot out of Steph setting really crappy screens and slipping them, because the defense is so worried about where he's going to go and whether that, over the years. But again, that's with Draymond facilitating from the top, where it's, he's setting those for Klay Thompson. And now if you're the defense, it's like, well, we're in a crappy spot either way on this, because we straight switch it, Thompson's going to shoot over, Curry gets the advantageous matchup and those things. But that's where I do think you can get a little bit more of that stuff, just more than Trae Young handling the ball 40 feet from the basket into yet another pick and roll. Like, just get a little bit more creative with your offense to find some more variance.
In true Hard Knocks form, we're already a couple minutes over on the first team.